In this episode, we're setting up our fireball ability to explode on impact. Oh yeah, and I forgot to mention the dynamic burn decals. Hey guys, welcome to today's episode, and today we're creating a standard, replicable, completely dynamic mechanism for generating in-game explosions. So that includes the Niagara System, that includes the audio, and last but not least, of course, what effects do we want the explosion to have in-game? So we're not yet doing damage in this episode, but we're building up to it, and as I mentioned in episode 29, decals come first. In episode 26, we began talking about how to conceptualize a gameplay ability system, and this episode focuses on the top right quadrant and the bottom right quadrant, specifically with the decals effect on the environment. Here are the key concepts for today. Initially, I was thinking about creating a separate explosion actor which would have all of this stuff on it, and ultimately I decided to just do it directly on our fireball itself because I was thinking about it in terms of how many mechanisms in my game are going to generate explosions. If there's a lot of different things generating explosions, you're probably going to want an independent explosion actor because then that actor can be spawned by any of those mechanisms. But in my case, there's not that many that are going to generate explosions. This fireball definitely, maybe a couple other things, but we'll see. So for now, I'm just doing it directly on the fireball actor. So to start this episode, we're going to set up our explosion Niagara system. But just like in episode 27 where we created the flamethrower effect, we have to convert a cascade system into Niagara. And so for that, make sure you've activated the Cascade to Niagara Converter plugin. So it's under Settings, Plugin, and if you search for Cascade, you'll find Cascade to Niagara Converter. And you just restart the engine and you should be good to go. So the explosion system that we're converting to Niagara is part of the starter content. So if you go to Content Drawer, navigate over to Starter Content. And by the way, if you don't see the Starter Content folder here, that just means you created your project without starter content. So you could create a new project and then copy those folders into your original project, and then you should be good to go. And then in Starter Content, we're going over to Particles, and then here's our explosion system. So with the Cascade to Niagara Converter plugin activated, you just right-click and then Convert to Niagara System. So now that I've got it converted, I'm just going to put it in the appropriate folder. So we're going to navigate to Niagara, and this is an impact effect. I'll actually go into that folder because I'm going to create a new folder, and this is going to be titled Fire. And let's give that a fiery color. So now I can go back into our Particles folder. I'm just going to click and drag, move that over to Fire. Move here. So over to Fire, and then I'm going to right click. We're going to rename this. This is going to be ns_explosion base. And if you followed along with the previous episodes and gameplay abilities, you know what's coming next. So we got to go into this. And once we're in the system, we have a whole bunch of these acknowledge errors. So acknowledge and clear this issue, acknowledge and clear this issue. And the first thing is we can deactivate two of these emitters. So we're not going to need sparks and we're not going to need smoke. Now, if you want smoke in your fireball, you could totally use that. I'm just not going to use it for the magic effect that I'm looking for. So I'll deactivate sparks, deactivate smoke, and we'll move those over. So now we have to go through each of these emitters and just acknowledge and clear this issue. This takes a while. I wish there was an easier way to do this, but this is the only way I know. And do that for each of the three emitters. So next we have a few settings we just got to change to get this up and running properly. So under our system here and under system state, we need to change our loop behavior here from infinite over to once because we only want this explosion to happen once. Now to get each of the emitters to follow the system, what we got to do is under emitter state here for each of the emitters, we have to change it from self lifecycle mode to system and do that for all three emitters. And then what you'll notice, the explosion happens once and then it's gone. So here's the good news. To update this system, it's really only one emitter that we're focused on, the fireball emitter. So you'll notice when the explosion happens, all the puffs of the fire, they're actually in different spots. And we want those to originate in one location. But first, let's make some other updates. So under spawn burst instantaneous here, I'm just going to double the spawn count to 12. Under initialize particle, we're going to change the lifetime to be a little bit shorter, 0.3 to 0.4 seconds. And the sprite size is going to be a little bit larger, from a minimum of 80 to a maximum of 150. And when we do that, we notice that the explosion is already a little bit better, like the fire is all emanating from that center. But just to tighten it up a little bit, under shape location here, I'm just going to set the sphere radius to 10. And that's going to originate the fire directly in the center. And there's just one more setting we need to update. So under scale sprite size here, I'm just going to make this a lot larger. So if I select our first key here at 0 seconds, it's going to be 0.125. So the size of the spawn when it initially spawns isn't going to be nothing. It's going to be small, but it's going to have a little bit of size. And then for our second key, if I select that, it's going to get a lot larger. So it's going to get to 3.5. And if I zoom out, then I can see the full curve. And then you can zoom out a little bit on the left-hand side, and you saw that when it spawns, it's a little bit bigger. It actually gives the impression that the fireball is expanding at a faster rate because the size is increasing. So the next step is to actually test this out in our world. So for testing, I'm just going to switch the system to spawn infinitely, and that way it just keeps looping. But I'm going to come back in right after, and then I'm going to set it to once. So let's drag this into our world. And I also want to make sure to turn on FPS so we can see the effect it has. All right, so I'm sitting at about 70, 65. Yeah, I barely even noticed the drop when the explosion happened. I think it was like a 1 to 2 FPS drop. Yeah, like 2 FPS tops. So we're good to go with that. I can delete out the system. We'll go back into it, and I'll just set the system state to be once. Save and compile. So now that we've got our Niagara system, the next step is to integrate it with our fireball actor that we started last episode. And if you're not following along with this series, that's totally fine. You just need to follow along with what I'm doing according to whatever mechanism in your game is actually going to trigger the explosion. So in our case, that's the BP fireball. So that's under content drawer. If I navigate back to content and then blueprints under spawn from abilities, that's what we created last episode. And when we set this up last episode, we set it up with a collision capsule. And that collision capsule was doing two things. It was allowing us to exert physics force on it so that the fireball actually moved in space. But then also it's going to tell our actor when it actually hits something. And so to enable that, to enable it to be able to send what are called hit events, we need to go over to the details panel and come down on the right-hand side here. And underneath collision presets here, we need to make sure to select simulation generates hit events. If you don't select that checkbox, everything I'm about to show you not going to work. And then the event that's actually going to tell the actor that it hit something is on component hit right here. So I'll hit the plus sign. So on component hit, this is where we're going to spawn our explosion system. So I can drag out a pin and I can spawn Niagara system and I can spawn system at location. And the reason I'm doing a spawn system at location instead of attached is because our overall fireball actor, it's not going to move anymore once this hit event happens. And the other reason is the location itself, because you might think, well, we can get our hit location, like we can break this, and then we can get our actual location of the hit and connect that up here. But what I found to look better instead is if we spawn the explosion at the exact location of our fireball Niagara system. Because you got to think of it in terms of the player's going to see the fireball moving towards its target, and at the same time that that fireball vanishes, you want to see an explosion originate from that exact point. So we can get our fireball Niagara system here, and then I'm just going to get the world location, and then I'll connect that up here. And lastly, I'll select NS explosion system, explosion base. So next, after the actual explosion system occurs, this is where we want to assess, okay, what are the actors in the area? And then we're going to apply some sort of effect to those actors, right? Whether it's damage, whether it's burn marks like we did a couple episodes ago. And that's where we're going to start this episode. And because an explosion starts in one point and then originates outward in all directions, we're going to do what's called a multi-sphere trace. So if I drag out a pin and I search for multi-sphere trace, 2 words, multi-space sphere, and we're going to do it by channel. And what multi-trace simply means is that we can hit more than once. And it's a sphere trace because an explosion, it's always originating in a sphere. The other thing I want to mention here is that we're not going to end up keeping this node. This is a short-term thing. But initially, this was the route I was going down. And instead of just jumping ahead to the route I ended up taking, I wanted to sort of show you what I went through and explain why I ended up going down a slightly different route. One reason is that sphere traces, generally speaking, are much more performance intensive than line traces. But I wanted to make sure to get every single actor, every single object in that radius. And so to set our radius, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use our intensity variable because that's going to drive the size of the explosion. And then what we're going to do is we're going to divide this, and we're dividing it by 2 to get the radius, to get half of that sphere. And then we're going to add 50 to it. And the reason I'm adding 50 is I always want the sphere trace to be slightly larger than what the explosion actually is so that I can get all the actors in the vicinity. And then hook that up here. And then the start and the end of the trace, well, the start and the end are exactly the same, but they're the same thing as this. So they're going to start and end wherever our fireball Niagara system is. And then the last thing for this node is I'm going to set the draw debug to for duration so we can actually see this be spawned. And so now the question is, what do we want to have happen after each hit? So first I'm going to do a branch here. So it's only going to go forward if we do get a hit. And then we get an array of out hits. And every time we see this square, that just indicates we have an array of items. And in this case, the array are actors, objects that we hit in the game. And that's the thing about multi-traces. Every time you do a multi-trace, it's going to return an array because it could be more than one actor. And every time we get an array, we need to break it apart into its constituent elements, into its individual actors, so we can then do something to each of those actors. And the way we do that is with a for each loop. And so I'm just going to move that over here. I'll put in a reroute node. and only if this is true. And then for each individual hit, what I can do is I can break it so I can get all the data from the hit. And what I want to do just for now is just get the hit actor. So I'm going to do a print string, because what we're going to do, actually let me just do from loop body here, I'll do print string. What we're going to do is we're going to print the name of whatever we hit. And then I can collapse this, and once it's completed, what do we want to have happen? Well, I can destroy the fireball, because once the explosion happens and it executes this and it does its thing, whatever we're going to have here, I don't need the fireball for anything else. So make sure you have this draw debug set to 4 duration, compile and save. Let's try this out. All right, here we go. So fireball, explosion. In the top left corner, it's saying it hit. Let me do that one more time so you can watch top left corner. BPP cliff formation 1. There we go. But the problem is the Niagara system here is still lingering around indefinitely. So even though we destroy the actor, the Niagara system is still spawning particles. So back in our BP fireball, what I'm going to do is I'm going to disconnect the destroy actor. This is going to be the last thing we do. But before we do that, we need to update the Niagara system to stop spawning particles. So what I can do is I can get a reference to our fireball Niagara system. And from here, I can set a float parameter. So particle system set float parameter. And the parameter we're setting is intensity. And the intensity is going to be set to 0. And this is updating our fireball system that we created last episode. And then the other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to move out destroy actor here, get another reference to our fireball Niagara system, and I'll also set a bool parameter, set bool parameter. And this is going to be set to spawn particles, and it's set to false. So both of these are basically doing the same thing. It's stopping the spawning of particles here and there. I probably don't need both, but I'm doing it just to be safe. Let's compile and save. We'll test this one more time. All right, so here we go. 3. Yep, and the system stops. The only thing I'm seeing that I still don't really like is that it takes a little bit too long for the fireball trail to diminish. Like, I think I'd like it to age a little bit faster when the collision actually occurs. So for this, we're going to update the Niagara system that we started last episode. So I'm going to go back to content and then content here, and it's under Niagara and our gameplay abilities, fire, and our fireball. And specifically the NS Fire Fireball with UP. So basically what we're going to do is for each of the emitters, flames, flame 001, distortion, we are going to update the particles age directly. And we're going to age the particles a lot faster, but only if the collision occurs. But if you remember from last episode, we don't have collision for these particles. So we need to tell it what is indicating the collision event. And what's actually indicating the collision event is we're setting the intensity down to 0. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to set a parameter directly right in the particle update. So I can hit plus here. I could say set parameter directly, set new or existing parameter directly. And the parameter that we're setting is the particle's age. I can drag that in here. And then we have the option of setting the age directly here, but that's not going to work, right? Because we need a criteria by which we're going to change the particle's age. And so what we're going to do is we're going to come down to this drop down and search for float from bool. And we can select this make custom float from bool. And so what's the bool? So the bool is going to be the criteria by which we want to age our particles more quickly, right? So the bool in this case is if user intensity equals 0. And so for the bool, I'm going to say float comparison. So set bool by float comparison. And so if user intensity equals 0, and the equals is this comparison type if A equal to B. So if user intensity equals 0, then it's going to set this bool to true and then do this. And if it's false, then it's going to do this. So if it's false, we just want the particle's age to still be the particle's age. So if this is false, then it's just still going to be the particle's age, meaning this does absolutely nothing. But if it's true, that's when we want to age the particles more quickly. And so for the true here, let's build this out first because the math is a little tricky, and then I'll explain how this is aging the particles more quickly. So the first thing is we're going to add a float. So I can search for add float, and what we're going to add is our particle's age to something else. Because at a minimum, it's always going to be the particle's age, but we're adding something onto it because the particle's aging faster. And so for the rest of this, let's just build it out, then I'll explain it. So if I go to B, we're going to divide float. And then for A here, we're going to subtract float. And the subtraction is going to be our particle's lifetime over here on the left, minus our particle's age. And then the B here is going to be 10. So here's what this is doing. So if our user intensity equals 0, meaning there are no more particles being spawned, then what we're doing is we're getting our particle's age, however old each of the particles that currently exists is. And then we're adding to that this here. And what this is it's getting the lifetime of each particle. It's subtracting from that the age of the particle currently, and dividing by 10. So basically it's 1/10 of the difference between where the particle is now in its age compared to its lifetime. And every tick, it's adding that 1/10, so our particle's aging much quicker. I know that's weird. I'm not a math guy. I played with this a lot just to get the right settings, and it's working well. And so now we're just going to copy this line in the stack, and then come down here also to flame 001. We're going to paste, do the same thing, and the same thing for the distortion. So under dynamic material parameters, paste, and then save, compile, and let's test this out again. All right, 3. Yeah, so now our fireball ages much faster. So when we see the explosion hit, you see the tail of it linger there just for a fraction of a second, and it disappears very quick. So we're all set with this fireball Niagara system. We can close this out. And so now let's pivot a little bit, and before we set up what we want to happen with this for each loop, let's instead set up our explosion system that we just created. Let's set that to actually be receptive to the intensity of the fireball. So very similar to previous episodes. Let's go back to our content drawer, let's go back to Niagara here, and then impact effects and under fire. And we got to make a duplicate of our NS explosion base system. So I'll right click and I'll duplicate, and it's going to be NS explosion and with UP for user parameters. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to close out of the base system just so I'm not updating that one. Got to make sure I'm updating the right one, and then we're going to go into the new one with UP. And also, just like past episodes, we're going to create a new user exposed parameter, make new. It's going to be under common, it's a float, and we're going to call this intensity. And then the nice thing about this is we don't really need to update the shockwave or the firelight. We just need to update the fireball itself. And so to start, we're going to update our fireball emitter. So let's select that one. And under spawn burst instantaneous, the spawn count, instead of keeping this a steady number, this is where our user intensity is going to come in. So we're going to select the drop down and search for divide int. Because this was 12 particles at its base, we're going to drag in our user intensity. And this is typically at about 100, but it could be as low as 20. So I'm just going to divide it by 5. So then if the intensity is 100, then it'll spawn 20 particles. And so now we're going to come down to the scale sprite size, because we want this explosion to be larger based on the intensity that we're passing in. And the way we can make a curve larger or smaller based on a user parameter is based on this uniform curve scale. So instead of just 1, we're just going to do add float. And then A is going to be 0.5. So at a minimum, it's always going to be half the size. So it's never going to be smaller than that. And B is we're going to divide our user intensity. We're going to divide it by 200. So if we have a user intensity of 100, then 100 divided by 200, 0.5 added to 0.5. So it'll be a regular uniform curve scale. But this way, if we have a huge user intensity, then it's still going to scale up the explosion. And then I'm also going to do the same thing for the shockwave. So not for the firelight, because we're going to have a separate mechanism for the light. But for the shockwave, definitely. So let's go to our scale sprite size here. Uniform curve scale, we're going to do add float. And again, starting at 0.5. And the B is going to be a divide float. And the division is our intensity divided by 200. And then let's compile and save. We are all set here. Let's go back to BP Fireball. So we got to come back to where we spawn our explosion system. So that's back here. It's right here. And I could create a new variable here, but I don't even think we need to, because once we set this explosion, it's a one-time explosion, it's done. We don't need to subsequently update it. So I'm just going to zoom out. I'm going to make some space here, drag this out, and I'll drag out a pin here, and I'll set float parameter. So set float parameter, hook this up, hook it up here, make a little bit more space, and the parameter that we're setting is our user intensity here. In the parameter name, just got to make sure this is case sensitive intensity. I think I'll also add a comment here. So C, spawn explosion system, and set intensity to be equal to fireball intensity. And then the last thing we have to do, don't forget to do this, is we got to switch out our system here. So instead of the base explosion, if I search for NS explosion again, we got to choose with UP. And just so that I can get a better visual test of this, I'm going to come over to our multi-sphere trace over here, change our draw debug to none so we don't have that, compile and save. And the last thing is under content drawer, if we go to our third person character blueprint, I'm just going to start with an intensity of 20 for this ability, and it should be a very small explosion. And then we'll crank it up to something ridiculous and we'll see how it looks. All right, here we go, 3. Yeah, baby explosion. Barely even notice. So now the intensity, let's crank that to like 500. Compile and save, and let's also look at our FPS and see what that does. All right, so it's sitting at around 63. Big explosion. But I'm not even noticing a drop in the frame rate. Maybe like a 1 or 2 FPS. Back down to 100, making that normal again. Compile, save. So now onto our explosion sound. And for the explosion sound, I first tried out a lot of explosions on Zapsplat, and to be honest, they all sounded way over the top. So I ended up doing something really simple. And we're taking the same exact sound that we used for our flamethrower in episode 27, and then we're also using that for our fireball last episode, but we're going to use that same exact sound again for the explosion. And what I ended up doing is I just ramped up the sound to something very high, like 5 times volume, and then down quickly with the explosion, and it ended up sounding a lot better than I expected. So let's navigate to our content drawer and into sound gameplay abilities fire. And the first thing is we're going to duplicate our fireball 1 cue. So we'll right click here, duplicate, and we'll name this fireball 1 explosion cue. And we'll go into that. And by the way, for our original fireball sound, I ended up lowering the pitch just a little bit here and also on this one. And so feel free to do that before you duplicate. But now we need to create a duplicate of our gameplay ability fire attenuation here. So if you go back to our content drawer, right click on this, duplicate, we're going to call this gameplay ability explosion attenuation. And the only difference here is instead of a fall off distance of 2000, I'm going to up that to 5000 because obviously the explosion is going to be a lot louder. And save that, exit out of this. So back in our fireball 1 explosion cue, we can then switch it out. Gameplay ability explosion attenuation. Save that. You could also crank up this volume multiplier here to 0.9. Now we're good for our cue. So back in our BP fireball, we're going to add a new audio component, and this is going to be our explosion. So I'm going to name this explosion sound. And make sure your sound cue here is blank by default. So here's how this is going to work. So when the fireball first hits, when we have this on component hit event, then it's going to set our fireball Niagara system, so the actual fireball, to stop spawning particles. And then it's going to play a very loud sound and ramp that sound down very quickly. And so to do that, I'm going to use a new piece of functionality we have yet to use in this series before called a timeline. And anytime you need a curve, you need to change a value over time, but you don't have something like an animation to do it, then you can do it on a blueprint via a timeline. And so to make a timeline to adjust our sound over time, I'm just going to come down underneath on component hit, right click and say add timeline, and select that. And I'm going to title this fireball explosion. And we can double click to go into the fireball explosion. And we need to add a track to it, which is basically the curve. And there are different types of tracks. To be honest, I've only ever used float or vector. But in this case, since we're just setting the volume over time, that's just a float. So we can add a float track. I'm going to make the length of this 1 second. And I can rename this to be explosion sound. So all the way at the start of the curve, we're going to add a key. And I'm just going to make that times 0 a value of 5 because our volume is going to be 5 times as loud. And if I zoom out, then I can see all the way up here. There it is. And we're going to do the same thing for the end of the curve. So we're going to add a key, but then at the end of the curve, at the end of 1 second, it's going to be a 0. And then if I zoom out, I can see that sound. It scales down really fast. And I want to smooth that out. So we're just going to auto tangent the same way we have before. So if I right click on the key, I can say auto, and you see it being smoothed out there. I'm going to do the same thing on this side, auto. But the other thing is for sound, it's going to be very loud to start, and it's not going to be a smooth taper. Like, it's going to drop precipitously. So what I'm going to do, if I select the top key, I can select this to kind of scale down the curve very quickly. So you see it getting more and more steep as I do that. So something like right there, maybe. And then over here, yeah, I don't think I need to adjust that at all. I think that looks pretty good. But that just gives it a much steeper curve. And we're actually going to add another curve to this timeline to adjust the light, but we'll do that in a little bit. So let's go back to our event graph. So what's going to happen when this timeline begins playing? Well, we're going to get our explosion sound here, and we're going to set a volume multiplier. And the volume multiplier is going to be the value of this curve over time. So I'll hook that up, hook up update here. But there's one last thing I want to do on this timeline itself. And if I come over to here, so we're destroying our actor right now at the end of this loop. And the problem is that loop's going to occur before the timeline even begins playing. So our sound is never going to get a chance to play. So I'm going to disconnect destroy actor here. And I'm going to bring it over to the end of our timeline. So we can say on our timeline being finished, then it's going to destroy the actor. So how do we call this timeline? Like, we got to make it play, right? So that's going to be in this execution pin string. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to reorganize some of this stuff. So instead of setting the fireball Niagara system to stop spawning at completed here, I'm just going to disconnect this. I'm going to move these over. I'm going to move this all the way out because this is going to be the last thing we do. And first, it's going to do this stuff. And then right after the fireball Niagara system stops spawning particles, that's when we're going to play the timeline. But the first thing we have to do is we have to set our explosion sound. So I can drag in a reference and I can set the sound. And what is our sound going to be? Well, this is going to be our fireball explosion cue. So fireball 1 explosion cue. Connect this up. And then we have to tell it, okay, now begin play. So instead of set sound here, I'm just going to say play. Play the sound. And then the last thing is we have to tell it to use the timeline, right? Because unless we tell it to use the timeline, its volume is just going to be standard 1. So for that, I can expand my components over here. I can get a reference to our timeline, fireball explosion, get, and then I can drag out and say play. And I can specifically select play from the start of the timeline and connect this up. So now I got to drag out all this even more, make more space. Don't worry, we're going to collapse a bunch of this stuff to a function. But before I hook up this entire string, there's one more thing I want to do. And that's the fact that, okay, we're not destroying the actor for 1 second after the hit occurs, right? Because we need that sound to play. But the problem is that physics is still enabled on our capsule component. So it's going to bounce right off of whatever object it hits for that 1 second. It's going to look really weird. And so what we need to do is we need to disable physics for our capsule component. So I'm just going to get a reference to our collision capsule. And then from here, I can set simulate physics, and I can set it specifically to false. But the other thing I found is that even though this will stop the capsule from moving, it'll still have collisions. So potentially the fireball's sitting there for 1 second and things can still collide into it, which doesn't make a lot of sense. So let's copy our reference to the collision capsule, and let's also set collision enabled to be no collision. All right, so now we got this string, this long string of stuff. We can hook it up here. And then after this long string of stuff, then it's going to do our multi-sphere trace. And we're going to end up changing this too, but I think you get the idea. So now if your setup looks like this, let me just run through it really quickly. So we spawn our Niagara system, our explosion system. It sets our intensity, and then it stops the fireball spawn. And then it sets our sound, it plays the explosion sound, and it plays our fireball explosion timeline from the start. And right after that, or as part of that same tick, it stops our collision capsule from moving with set simulate physics, and no more collision on our collision capsule. And then after 1 second of our timeline, then it destroys the actor. But during that 1 second, it's updating our explosion sound to be playing according to the volume multiplier from this curve. So let's compile and save, and let's test this out. All right, so here we go. Nice little explosion sound, but I do see a couple of problems. So you might have noticed that the light still lingers for that 1 second before we destroy the actor. And then the other problem is our original fireball sound that's also lingering after the explosion sound. So let's take care of the fireball sound lingering, and then we'll take care of the light issue. So the reason that it's lingering is back in our last episode, we created this update volume and pitch over fireball lifetime. And so it's always generating the sound. It's continuing the sound based on our current fireball intensity. And it's doing that over that remaining 1 second of its lifetime. So what we got to do is when that fireball hits, we got to set this intensity down to 0. But if we do that, then it's not going to be able to effectively drive some other behavior. And so what we're going to do is we're going to set a new variable. I'm going to create a new variable called intensity at explosion. And this is going to be a float. And I'll compile and save that. And let's go back to our event graph here. And then I'm going to set this intensity at explosion. I'm going to set that right here. I gotta move this out, make some space. So much space. Okay, so we got our intensity at explosion, and we're setting this to be our intensity variable here, just like that. But then we need to set our intensity to 0 right after this, because this is basically serving as a placeholder. We're gonna keep this value so we can do stuff with it. We know how intense the fireball was at explosion. But then this intensity, we're gonna set that to 0. Connect this up. And connect this up here. All right, let's compile and save. Let's test out the sound again. So this should resolve all of our sound issues. I think I want to make the sound actually taper off a little bit faster even. So we can go back into our timeline. Let me go into our timeline here. And instead of this curve being rounded, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to add a key. I'm going to move this down a little bit faster. Just like that, and I can also auto tangent. Ooh, not that much, so something like this maybe. Yeah, so our sound goes down very quickly, and then it tapers off kind of slowly. Let's try that one more time. Yeah, it's a much more sudden sound. It's like boom and done, and I think I like that a little bit better. So now let's take care of the issue where the light is lingering. And where that's coming from is our fireball light that we set up last episode. And it's keeping to an intensity of 5,000 all the way up to when our fireball explosion completes and then it destroys the actor. So what if we add a second curve here where we can ramp up the intensity of this light suddenly with the explosion, and then we can scale it down very quickly. So I can go back into the timeline here, and we're going to add a second track, add another float track. And I'm going to title this our light intensity. And I can right click, I can add a key. And this key is going to be at time 0, a value of 6. And I can also zoom out of that a little bit because we want our light to ramp up a lot. But for light, the effect of that's going to ramp down a lot faster than even the sound. So for that, I'm going to right click, add a key. And this one I'm going to add for time 0.4, so 4/10 of a second. And the value is going to be 0. And then of course I'm going to right click, auto tangent this, and then right click, auto tangent that. So our light is going to go down much faster than our sound. So now let's go back to the event graph. And then for the light intensity, well, first we got to get a reference to our fireball light. So I can drag that in and I can set our intensity and I can connect this up. And then we have to set it based on our light intensity here. But the problem is, well, it's not going to be 6, right? Because our fireball light is not an intensity of 6, it's 5,000. So we got to figure out how intense we want to make it. And so for that, I'm going to use the intensity at explosion variable we just created. So we're going to get our intensity at explosion, and then we're going to multiply this number by 50. And I found that to be a good number just in experimentation. And I'm just going to move the 3 of these down a little bit, and the light intensity, that's what's going to be multiplied by this number right here. So move this over here, move this over there, and this is going to be connected here. So that's looking good. Compile and save. The last thing I want to do before testing this final test is I want to collapse a whole bunch of stuff to a function. So all of this string of stuff right here, from set float parameter all the way over. So I can highlight all that, can right click, and I can say collapse to function. And then I can right click over here, rename, and we're just going to title this Explode Fireball. Compile and save. And then I'll come over here, move all this stuff over. A lot less space now. All right, so now the sound should be close to perfect, I hope. And the light should suddenly grow bright with the explosion and scale down instantly. So here we go. Yeah. So we got a pretty bright explosion, and then boom, disappears. So now we get into the complicated stuff. And I've said this a few times before during the series, but anytime that the player's doing anything in the world, I want it to cause some kind of effect. I really want to give the player a sense of presence, like they and the world are interconnected. So that means that the world needs to be responsive in some way, shape, or form in terms of what they're doing. Now in the future, obviously this fireball is going to do damage, but we're going to start small and work our way up. So we're going to continue off of the decals that we started 2 episodes ago in episode 29. And if you haven't already, I strongly encourage you to check out that episode, because if you want to follow along with what we're doing next, you're going to need that setup. So the first thing we're going to do, over to our multi-sphere trace by channel here. We got to change our trace channel from visibility over to decal. And what this is going to do is it's going to check in the vicinity, do we have a decal already spawned? Or more than one decal, because it's checking every single hit of the multi-sphere trace. So then I'm coming over here, I'm going to delete all this out. So now we can copy a lot of the setup that we did on our gameplay ability fire blueprint back in episode 29. So let's go through that now. So if I go back over to my gameplay ability fire and then over to the event graph, and if I come down on my event graph, we got to come down to our event receive particle data, because this is what we set up with the flamethrower in episode 29. Basically, the fire particles in the Niagara system, they hit something, and then for each thing that they hit, it's returning some data, and then it's doing this fire decal update. So in our fire decal update function, it's passing in the particle data that we're getting from the flamethrower Niagara system. And then it's doing a trace from our hand to that location. And if that trace hits a decal, so it's specifically looking at decals, then it darkens the decal. It casts to the fire decal actor that we set up in episode 29, and it darkens the decal. Now, if it doesn't get a hit, then we do another line trace, and we do this one on visibility instead of decal. And so for that, if it gets a hit, it gets the physical material of that hit. And then based on the surface type, it sets whether or not that material is flammable, and it sets a burnability value. And this determines how quickly that material actually darkens and burns. And then it spawns a new fire decal actor here, where it passes in that flammable value and that burnable value from here. And when I first created burn decals back in episode 29, quite frankly, I was not thinking far enough ahead, because all of this stuff, whether or not what we hit is flammable, its burnability, all of that should really live on the burn decal actor. Because instead of passing in all this convoluted stuff, really all we need to pass in is whatever surface type we're hitting, and then the actor itself should figure all this out. And the reason for that is because there are going to be many mechanisms that can actually trigger these burn decals throughout our game. We're already on to our second one, which is the explosion. So we got the flamethrower, we got explosions, could have other things too. And so all that setup that actually specifies how that actor evolves and behaves, that should be on the actor itself. So all we need to do is pass into the actor what surface it's spawned on, and then it can take care of the rest. So let's update all of this right now. We'll go into our fire decal BP, we'll update it with all of this stuff, and we'll take it out of our gameplay ability fire. And so for that, I got to go back to our content drawer, back to blueprints, and we created a folder in episode 29 for decals. We have our fire decal BP. Now the very first thing we're going to do is create a new variable, and that's that surface type I was talking about. So we'll hit plus sign, and we'll call this the surface type decal is on. And the type is going to be E physical surface, which is kind of weird, but E physical surface, and that's an enum. And that, of course, is going to be instance editable and exposed on spawn because we're going to pass that data into the blueprint as soon as it's spawned. So we'll compile and save this, and then back in our gameplay ability fire blueprint, we're going to copy all of this right here, all of this stuff, copy it back into our fire decal BP. We have to do all of this on the construction script, and it's going to be the very first thing we do. And the reason it has to be on our construction script is because whether or not the decal is flammable, that's going to determine which child material we use. So I'll move out our construction script even more, and then we will paste. And I'm just pasting this in here just to serve as a reference while we get this set up. So we'll get our surface type decal is on, get, and then we'll switch on E physical surface and connect this up here. And then I can get a reference to our flammable here. It's going to be set, and then the same thing for burnability and set. And I'll just duplicate this. I think it's about 7 times, actually 8 times. And then I'm literally just going to copy what we have here. And then I can hook up all of these. So default, forest floor, grass, and hook them up here. Should have hooked them up before I copied them, huh? All right, so that we can copy these, let's put these off to the side. We'll move these up a little bit. And let's move all this stuff out. And I'm just going to make it match exactly. So flammable, 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 and flammable. And I apologize for this, guys. I'm still learning as I'm doing this. And inevitably, I'm going to be figuring out things as I go along. All right, we're good here. Delete out all of this. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a reroute node just so I can bring all of these together. Add reroute. And then just confirm that this looks realistic. So grass is flammable, forest floor, dirt, stone is not, wet dirt is not, wood is, water is not. And then this right here can get hooked up directly to our branch. We can move all this back. And the last thing we can do is we can set our flammable and our burnability to no longer be exposed on spawn because we're setting those automatically based on the surface type the decal is on. That's what's going to be exposed on spawn. So burnability as well, uncheck expose on spawn, compile and save. Let's go back to our gameplay ability fire, and then for this spawn actor fire decal BP, let's switch it to none, and then we'll switch it back to fire decal BP. And then I can cut out both of these. And then this can be simplified considerably. So we can cut out all of this here, delete out that, and I'll bring down our surface type down here, and our surface type can be hooked up directly to this. And I can move this way in, and this one over. How's that? A little bit cleaner? Compile and save. Now it's a good idea whenever we change something that's already working, let's just make sure it still works. So I'm going to test out my flamethrower really quickly. All right, 2. Our burn decals still burning, still darkening. So far so good. So now it's back to BP Fireball. And so where we left this off is we're using our trace channel of decal. And so if we get a hit on a decal actor with this multi-sphere trace, what do we want to have happen? So I'm going to break our hit result from here. And then we're going to get the actual actor that we're hitting. And from that, that's going to be our fire decal actor. We can cast to fire decal BP. Connect this up, collapse this. And then from here, we can darken decal, which is a function we created in episode 29. And the fire intensity, well, we're going to get our intensity at explosion. But then I noticed the effect of this was very strong if we didn't dilute it a little bit. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to divide it by about 200 and then attach it here. Compile and save. So this takes care of it if we hit a decal already, and then we can just darken that decal. But then the question is, okay, if we don't hit a decal, if this is false, then what do we want to have happen? So initially I decided to do a very similar thing. So I tried out the multi-sphere trace by channel. But the problem I was running into is when I did it that way for spawning decals, the normal of the sphere trace was not returning the right angle of the surface that was being hit. And so what we're going to end up doing, and actually we're going to do this for both traces, we're going to do another line trace, just like we did in episode 29. But in this case, it's a little bit more complicated than what we did for episode 29, because in that episode, we were doing individual line traces for each particle that was hitting. And here we're doing line traces in a sphere. So we need to do line traces from the center point, wherever that fireball is, but then outward, equidistant, I think that's the math word, right? Equidistant points all along a sphere, however big that fireball explosion is. So the first question is, how many line traces do we do outward to get get an accurate sphere, or at least a representative shape of a sphere explosion. And then the second question is, how do we make them all go in different directions? So when playing with this, I found that doing about 20 individual line traces for an intensity explosion of about 100, it worked out pretty well. So from the false pin here, we're going to come down and do a for loop. And it's not a for each loop, it's actually a for loop, because we're not doing it based on a trace, we're just doing a specific number of loops. And the first index is always 0, but our last index, so the number of loops we do for the sphere, it's going to be different depending on how big our explosion is. Because the larger the explosion, the more individual traces you're going to need to make sure you hit everything in that vicinity. And so we're going to get our intensity at explosion, and then we're going to divide this by 5. Divide by 5. So if it's 100, then 20 line traces, and that's going to be our last index. And actually it'll be 21 because it always starts at 0. But the other thing I considered is that, okay, even when this is completed, we still wanted to do these traces down here, because maybe it only hit 2 existing decals, but it needs to still trace in all the other directions to see if a decal needs to be spawned. So I can drag out a pin from completed down here. And by the way, this is temporary. We're actually going to end up using a for loop for both of these, but hold tight on that. So next, in our loop body, this is where we need to do a line trace by channel. So line trace by channel. And again, we're doing 20 of these, or basically however many we need based on the intensity at explosion. So the start is always going to be wherever our fireball is. So visually, that's represented by the location of our fireball Niagara system. So I can get our world location and connect that up. But now the question is, how do we get a random point in a radius around that start location? And so for that, we're going to use something called a random unit vector. So if I search for random unit vector, so what this is doing is it's getting a vector, so 3 values, x and y and z, and with a unit vector, they always add up to 1. And so basically what that's doing is the vector is pointing in a random direction. But that just gives us a direction, because it's basically saying go 1 unit in this particular direction, like 1 centimeter. And so what we really need is we need to go a certain number of centimeters away from our world location. And so for that, we're going to add our world location, not directly to this, let me just make some space, but then we're going to multiply this by our intensity value to figure out, well, how far out do we need to go to make sure the explosion hits everything in the vicinity. So we can get our intensity at explosion, and I'm just going to divide that by 2 because that's going to give us our radius. And then I'm also going to add 50 to this. So at a minimum, our explosion is always going to be a size of 50. And I'm going to move both of these out a little bit. I'll put the random unit vector here, and this is what's going to get multiplied to our random unit vector. And this is going to give us an overall direction with a strength equal to the intensity at explosion. Well, equal to it divided by 2 plus 50. And then I can connect it up here and connect this up to the end. And reposition all this slightly. Compile and save. So let's test this out. Let's just see the traces going on. So I'm going to come down to draw debug type. We're going to make this for duration. We should see a bunch of lines all tracing outward from the fireball when it hits. Compile, save, and let's test it out. All right, moment of truth. Yeah. There they are. So all the different hits, and we see the actual hits on our rock face there. And so next, from this, that's where we're going to spawn our new fire decal actor. And so first, we're only going to proceed further if we get an actual hit here. So I'll add a branch. And then we need to break our hit result again because we need to get some data from this. I'll expand this. And then from the true here, this is where I'm going to spawn actor from class. And this is where we're choosing our fire decal actor BP, fire decal BP. So I can get our physical material, I can get our surface type, and then from the surface type, hook that up here. From the transform, I'm going to split this. So our location is going to be here. From the impact normal, just like episode 29, we're going to make a rotator from Z, hook that up to the rotation, collapse this. And so also, just like episode 29, I'm going to split the struck pin here, and I'm going to randomize up the X and the Y. And that's going to give us some variability in the size and shape of the decal. So 0.8 to 1.2, and I'll duplicate that, and we'll do the same exact thing for the Y. Compile and save. And so the final optimization I want to do before we test this is actually something that we did in episode 29, but I want to change it just a little bit. And that is the child material we created for flammable surface types. I set the initial opacity to be 0.25, and I just found that it's a better effect if we lower that a little bit to 0.1. So I'm going to go to our content drawer and then over to MS presets and MMS decal material, and then it's the flammable child material. Just going to set this default opacity intensity to 0.1, and that matches the same opacity intensity that we had for our non-flammable child material, and save that. Before we test this out, I'm going to turn on detailed stats, because initially I was really paranoid about, well, what's going to happen when we have all these decals from all these fireballs all over our level. And it turned out it wasn't nearly as bad as I expected. So I'm going to go to Stat, Engine, Detailed. So that gives us our FPS, it gives us our frame, game, draw, GPU, all that fun stuff. So let's play. All right, here we go. Let's go crazy. Looks pretty reasonable, right? We got all these burn marks all over the place. And actually, one of the gameplay mechanics I have in mind for the future is that the player is going to be able to remove these decals with spells, with something I have in mind. And that removal, that healing of the world, that's going to end up granting the player some bonuses. And so it's a way of tying gameplay in with improving performance by removing decals in the world. Just an idea I have. We're going to get there. But here's the thing, I was thinking about this setup more and I realized fundamentally this could still be optimized a lot for performance. And one reason is because the multi-sphere trace by channel, that's a lot more performance intensive than even doing 20 of these. But the other thing is that this trace and this trace, they're not necessarily matching up to the same locations of decals. And so because of that, inevitably there's going to be duplicative decals spawned on the same spot. And so I realized to avoid the duplicate decals, what we need to do is we need to keep our traces identical in where they're going. So what I want to do is I basically want to take this line trace by channel here and replicate it up here, but use a trace channel of decal. And then both of the traces can use the exact same start location and the exact end location. And that way we're not spawning decals on top of a place that already has a decal. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to disconnect this. We're going to disconnect both of these pins. We're going to move this up. This is going to be moved up much further to the front. And we're going to delete out everything from here over to break hit result here. And so then what we're going to do is I'm going to come down here. I'm going to copy all of this up to branch and break hit result. Copy that. Come up here, paste it here, and expand it here. And then from our hit actor, we're going to cast a fire decal BP only if it's true. And then move this stuff a little bit closer. Collapse this, change this trace channel over to decal. And then this is where I'm going to bring in my for loop. So I'm going to bring in the for loop up here, move this down a little bit. So the for loop is going to start with our line trace by channel for decals. And then if it doesn't get a hit, so only if it doesn't get a hit, so it's still only doing 20 loops. If the intensity at explosion is 100, it's doing 20 loops. But if the intensity at explosion is, let's say, 10, then it's only doing 2 loops. But anyway, so it does the decal line trace by channel first, and only if it doesn't get the hit, then it does a second line trace by channel. But we need to make sure the start and the end of this one match exactly to this one, and that's what's going to prevent a duplicative decal from being spawned. And so to do that, I'm just going to drag down all of this, and I'm going to connect it up to the second one right here as well. It's going to use the same exact set of data. I can move this out a little bit, and we can delete out this here. Realize that looks messy, so let's just move this over, clean this up a little bit. Move the for loop out here. So it should look like this, but let's trace this out. Okay, so we explode our fireball, and that does all the things with physics. It starts the light shining really brightly, it makes the sound, and then it does a for loop. It does a number of for loops based on our intensity at explosion divided by 5. The first thing it does in the for loop is it does a line trace by channel specifically for decals. For each of those 20, let's say 20 in this case, then if it gets a hit actor of our fire decal, then it casts a fire decal BP and darkens decal. And this, by the way, instead of dividing by 200, we can now change this to divide by 10. And the reason is because we're going to get a lot fewer hits this way than doing the sphere trace, which is much more performance intensive. Okay, so for each of those 20 line traces, if it hits here and it doesn't get a decal hit, it goes to false and it does another line trace at that same location where it did a initial decal trace. And then it says, okay, if I get a hit there, if that's true, then we're going to spawn a fire decal BP. And this one is tracing visibility, and it's passing in our surface type, it's spawning a decal according to a somewhat random transform, and it's spawning it on the impact normal, the normal of the surface that it's hitting. All right, compile and save, let's test this out. Will be good to test out our performance on this one. Okay, here we go. All right, looking good. And let's nuke one spot over and over. All right, so it darkens slowly over time. A single hit doesn't darken it much. Very subtle darkening, but if we hit it multiple times, well, then it's solid. So let's do a little bit of cleanup. So our line trace by channels, let's set this to none. And we'll set this one also to none. Compile, save. And I just want to do one other thing just for fun. So let's go back into our third person character blueprint. And let's set the intensity to something truly redonkulous. So intensity, let's set this to, what do you say, 10,000? Compile and save. Does nobody say redonkulous anymore? Is that not a thing? Okay, so 3, here we go. And nuclear launch detected. All right, back to a normalized 100. Compile and save. As always, let's do some final cleanup here. So let's go over to our BP fireball. And for this top part, so this right here, I'm going to highlight all this. I'm going to comment it. This is going to be our existing decal check. And this is going to be spawns decal if no decal hit. So I'm going to zoom out. I'm going to comment all of this. And we're going to do a big comment. And that comment is going to be random checks in all directions for decals and then spawns decals as needed. Compile and save. One last note on how you might want to design this differently. So in my game, I'm not thinking there's going to be that many mechanisms to generate explosions. But if there are lots of different things that could generate explosions, instead of doing the explosion directly on the fireball actor like we did in this episode, instead I would do it on its own separate actor. And that way you could have the timeline on the explosion actor, you have a separate sound, you have the Niagara system on that actor, and then you could do all sorts of things with that explosion. And who knows, I might end up going down that route in the future. But I think the fireball in our game is going to be one of the very few things that creates explosions, and so I can keep it directly on the fireball actor. But if you're far more experienced at this than I am and you disagree, please leave a comment directly below. Just one really quick issue fix, guys. So I noticed that the explosion sound, regardless of the distance away from the player, it was always the same volume. And I realized that the issue is I forgot to put the explosion sound underneath our collision capsule. And because it wasn't attached to our collision capsule, the audio component never moved when the fireball actually left the player's hand. So compile, save, we could test this out one last time. So up close, and then further away. Still hear it, but it's a lot further away. So that concludes our episode for today. And for the last 5 episodes or so, we've been going hard with these gameplay abilities. And so I think it's time to take a slight detour. And you'll see at the bottom of our screen there, I now have this gameplay ability hotbar UI. And that's what I want to start getting into. We have 3 gameplay abilities now. It's time to put together at least a preliminary basic UI. And so over this series of the next few episodes, you're going to see how A, we put together the hotbar, B, how we get ability pickups to go automatically into our hotbar, and then C, how we can put together a simple system for our inventory for gameplay abilities. So I can drag and drop an ability into my inventory, I can move it around, and then of course each of those buttons corresponds to my keyboard. If I want a fireball, 5, and so I hope to see you there at the start of the next episode.